on approach to Raleigh-Durham Airport.
Did we just have a flameout?
The pilots decide to abort their landing.
When you have an engine failure, you lose 80% of your performance.
Let's go, Mr. Approach.
But the plan falls apart.
Lower the nose.
We were going down.
Only 5 of the 20 people on board survive. NTSB investigators are puzzled by the wreckage of Flight 3379.
It appears the engines are rotating at full power.
So what went wrong?
Only by taking a test flight to the brink of disaster
Yawing to the left.
will an astonishing sequence of events be revealed.
This airplane had to crash.
American Eagle Flight 3379 approaches Raleigh-Durham International Airport.
Okay, can you do the descent checklist, please?
In the cockpit, Captain Mike Hillis and First Officer Matthew Saylor prepare for landing.
Altimeter 3031, set, cross-checked.
3031, set, cross-checked.
These were young pilots just starting off in their career. They were looking to go work at the major airlines where the pay and benefits were substantially better.
The pilots are flying a Jetstream 3201, a twin turboprop airplane designed for short flights. It's a workhorse for regional airlines like American Eagle.
Turboprop engines run more efficiently at lower altitudes. They're actually more fuel efficient. So on these short-haul routes, the Jetstream pretty much fit that market.
Flight 3379 took off at 6 p.m. from Greensboro, North Carolina. It's a 35-minute flight to Raleigh-Durham Airport.
Well, folks, at this time, we're about 10.8 miles from Raleigh-Durham International Airport, about 5 minutes out, and we're about to begin our approach. Weather tonight's not very good in Raleigh. 2-mile visibility because of rain and fog, and the winds are out of the north at 6 miles an hour.
There are 18 passengers on board tonight. Among them, college student Lauren Anderson.
I had been up the night before. I'd stayed up all night, pulled an all-nighter, wrote a paper, and slid it under the door of my English professor that morning. So I was pretty tired. It had been a long week of finals. I was ready to get home.
Eagle Flight 3379, and reduced to 170, then descend and maintain 3,000.
10 miles from Raleigh-Durham, Flight 3379 is cleared to begin its descent.
170, then 3000, 3379.
The flight crew reduces engine power. In a turboprop plane, the engine power and the propeller speed are controlled separately.
The Jetstream 32 had no autopilot, so you were always hand flying it. It was one of the most demanding airplanes on a pilot's flying skills.
Descending to 3,000 feet, the crew keeps a close eye on the weather.
When you get a chance, look out your window and see if you see any of that ice.
Yeah, I was looking out there. I don't see anything right now.
Icing can be a major threat to an aircraft. It not only increases the weight of it, but also spoils the aerodynamics over the wing.
Icing isn't the only hazard facing the pilots.
Eagle Flight 3379, caution wake turbulence. You're spacing on a 727. Turn left 190.
There's a 727 landing ahead of Flight 3379, which creates a potential hazard for the Jetstream.
Heavy aircraft tend to generate very strong horizontal tornadoes called vortexes that come off the wingtips. If a smaller aircraft has an encounter with wake turbulence, it could be so powerful that it's beyond the control of the pilot to counteract it.
Left 190, 3379.
For safety, the pilots make a minor adjustment to their course.
Eagle Flight 3379, Raleigh, clear to land. Wind 010 at 8. Traffic 3.5 mile final at 727.
Cleared to land 5 left, 3379.
Once the Boeing 727 touches down, Flight 3379 will be cleared to land.
We didn't anticipate any issues. It was the same old, I'd say. I probably had taken that flight 3 times already that year.
And gear down.
Gear down.
The pilots configure the plane for landing.
Flaps 20.
Flaps 20.
Just minutes before touchdown,
Why is that ignition light on? Did we just have a flame out?
the engine ignition light illuminates.
Seeing the ignition light come on during approach would typically raise a concern. If combustion is interrupted for any reason, it's what pilots call a flame out or an engine failure.
I'm not sure what's going on with it.
If there is an engine failure, the pilots need to reconsider landing.
The pilot would have to make the decision whether to continue the approach or abort the approach and see what the problem is.
What do you want me to do? Are you going to continue?
Okay, yeah. I'm gonna continue. Just back me up.
Captain Hillis decides to land.
All right. Let's go, Mr. Approach.
But then, he reverses his decision.
A go-around or a missed approach would have given the pilot more time to run an engine failure checklist. When you're on final, you really don't have that much time to complete it.
Set max power.
Now, at 1,500 feet, Captain Hillis aborts the landing.
When you have an engine failure, you not only lost half your power, you lose 80% of your performance.
Flight 3379 isn't climbing, and it's losing speed.
Lower the nose. Lower the nose.
At 1,400 feet, the plane is stalling.
You got it?
Yeah.
They're unable to climb. They're starting to lose directional control of the aircraft.
Flight 3379 is turning steadily to the left, veering further off course.
Lower the nose.
Things are getting bad real fast, and they're running out of time.
Here.
Plunging rapidly towards the ground, the pilots fight to recover their plane.
There's no flight attendant on the plane. There was a lot of commotion. You could hear some kind of warning siren. I was scared. People were scared. We knew we were crashing. I knew we were going down. I just braced myself, literally putting my hand and my foot on the seat in front of me. had a moment that, okay, I need to survive. I need to live through this. When we crashed, I just remember hitting ground very, very fast, very hard.
Flight 3379 has just plowed through the dense woods of North Carolina. It's now a pile of burning wreckage.
The plane split, literally, in between my seat and the seat in front of me. I can remember taking my seatbelt off and hearing people moaning and people screaming. I couldn't see anything. I don't know if I lost my contacts or I just had fuel in my eyes. I couldn't walk, but my adrenaline was pumping. I was in fight or flight mode. My intuition was that I had to survive. And somehow I got away from the fire.
Morrisville firefighter David Farrell is one of the first responders on site.
And your heart's racing. I mean, you know you're probably fixing to encounter one of the worst things you've ever been in your life. You could see the fire. Your heart was in your throat. You know, I mean, your adrenaline's pumping, you're scared. As I got closer to the scene, something caught my eye. And I looked down. I saw a female pulling herself away from the fire, and she couldn't move her legs.
He had asked my name, and I told him I needed to find my suitcase and that I needed to get home.
I said, you're gonna make it. You're not gonna die on my watch. You're through the worst of this, and we're gonna get you out of here.
Lauren Anderson is one of only 5 survivors. 15 others are killed.
I did break bones in my hand, my clavicle, broke my ribs, punctured my lungs. I broke and dislocated my back, tibia, fibula break in my left leg, bones in my ankle.
Captain Mike Hillis and First Officer Matthew Saylor are among the dead. National Transportation Safety Board investigators are on site by morning.
Any luck finding the data recorders?
Team's still looking. The weather wasn't great last night.
Well, I'm gonna need the pilot's record of icing and the weather data.
In this particular accident, icing was very paramount because 3379 was a second accident for the American Eagle. Just a few weeks past, we'd had another Jetstream involved with icing conditions.
Was icing the reason Flight 3379 failed to make it to the airport, just 4 miles away?
The landing gear's down.
Do they know how the flaps are set?
I'll check with that guy in the cockpit. Stretch here, what can you tell us about the flap selector?
The cockpit section was particularly damaged. A lot of the controls, a lot of the instruments, we were unable to document.
The flap selector is fused in the 20-degree position.
Copy that.
The flap extension was also very interesting because it was in the landing configuration.
Thank you very much. plane was iced up as they were landing, and that's trouble.
We had to start making major inquiries into the possibility of an icing involvement.
These are pilot reports from 5 other planes flying into Raleigh. We do have pilots reporting light icing, but just trace icing at high altitudes.
Investigators learned that the other pilots flying near Raleigh-Durham weren't reporting any significant issues with icing.
The icing, although it was present in the area, was absolutely no factor in the accident investigation.
They were all set to land. So what went wrong?
Maybe they had engine trouble.
The investigators had a major challenge trying to figure out if one of the engines had malfunctioned in some way.
Hey, can you bring that blade over here, please? Thank you, sir. Now, is this blade from the left propeller?
Yes, this is from the right propeller.
The team examines the propellers for an indication that they were rotating.
Man, it's bad. And look at the damage right here.
The way the blade is damaged provides a clue.
If you've got turning propellers on your airplane, they tend to grab into things and bend forward as they hit the debris of trees and so on.
It appears the engines are rotating at full power.
So he's 4 miles from the airport. He's configured to land. What happened?
As we spent more time on site with 3379 wreckage, the questions just kept coming. It made it very clear that this accident was going to be a real puzzler.
Were the pilots reporting any problems during their approach?
Let me have a look.
NTSB investigators hope the pilots' conversations with air traffic controllers can shed some light on why Flight 3379 crashed before reaching Raleigh-Durham Airport.
They're the last people to talk to the crew, and we want to know if there was anything unusual in their conversations.
No, there wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Eagle Flight 3379, reduced to 170, then descend and maintain 3000.
The controller tells investigators that Flight 3379's approach seemed routine.
170, then 3000.
3379?
Was there any conflicting traffic as they were coming in?
Well, yes. There was a 727 landing right ahead of them. I warned them about wake turbulence. Eagle Flight 3379, caution wake turbulence. You're spacing on a 727, turn left 190.
The wake turbulence issue is particularly critical. This would be a factor that we were going to have to deal with.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
How fast does a wake vortex descend?
300 feet per minute.
Investigators compare the flight path of Flight 3379 with the estimated path of the wake vortex.
All right, let's see what we got.
They use recorded radar returns for both planes and factor in the weather at the time of the accident.
Looks like Flight 3379 missed it.
By more than 600 feet.
The Jetstream did not fly through any of those vortexes. Wake turbulence did not affect the flight path of the accident aircraft.
But the radar data reveals that something happened along the flight path.
According to this, he veers off course after missing the wake vortices.
He's off to the left. Why?
Why is this aircraft over here to the left of the final approach path configured to land?
Okay, can you do the descent checklist, please?
The team turned to the cockpit voice recorder, hoping they might find an explanation for the unusual left turn.
We were going to really have to look at what was going on the flight deck with the cockpit crew. What were they saying? What were their intentions?
Altimeter 3031 set, cross-checked. Pressurization set and checked. Ice protection is on.
Investigators hear the captain and first officer planning the approach with precision.
Okay, reviewed.
So far, so good.
The flight crew seems to be working in perfect tandem as Flight 3379 approaches the airport.
Why is that ignition light on? Did we just have a flame out?
Did you just say flame out? Play that again.
Did we just have a flame out? When the captain talks about the ignition light, that came out of nowhere. We had a flame out.
We lost the left one?
Yeah.
They discover that the ignition light illuminated moments before the crash.
This ignition light introduced the thought of a lost engine. Considering the physical evidence we'd seen, this idea was very strange. You would expect during that period that there would be some sort of confirmation. Nothing happened other than absolute quiet. We needed to try and figure out what was going on.
These are the engine sound waves from when the ignition light went on.
Another way for investigators to determine if the engines were operating is to analyze their sound on the cockpit voice recording.
This study is attempting to home in on blade passing frequencies. Blade passing meaning all these revolutions of the propeller.
Call up the comparison.
They compare the engine sounds from Flight 3379 to other engines operating at 100%.
We're looking at the acoustics of the engine performance, and it's relatively easy to match that against the acoustics of a working engine.
They're almost identical.
Investigators hear evidence that both engines were running at full speed.
The sound analysis told us that the sounds generated by the engines on this aircraft were consistent with two engines generating power.
The ignition light must have misled the pilots into believing the left engine flamed out.
Not really. It hadn't.
This sound analysis put the idea of an engine failure to bed. It just wasn't a factor in the accident.
This discovery leaves investigators puzzled.
Why was that ignition light on if there was nothing wrong with the engine?
Why is that ignition light on? Did we just have a flame out?
Investigators examine Jetstream manuals to determine why an ignition light would come on even though the plane's engines were fully operational.
So what activates it?
It's wired to a negative torque system.
Negative torque occurs when the air loads on the propellers cause them to drive the engines, instead of the engines driving the propellers. It can be a sign of a flameout.
This is the same scenario you would have as when you put your car in low gear going down a hill and use the transmission to drag.
It says the ignition light will activate if they advance the propeller speed too quickly.
There was a situation when you would be at a low power setting on your torque, and as you go speeds high in preparation for landing, if you move those speed levers up too quickly, that could trigger the negative torque to cause that light to come on.
Go ahead. Flaps 10.
Investigators return to the CVR to learn if the pilots mention increasing the propeller speed.
Let's go ahead and go speeds high.
They hear Captain Hillis advancing the propellers to 100% for landing.
Why's that ignition light on?
There it is. He advanced through propeller speed and boom, the ignition light illuminates.
The team discovers that the pilots created negative torque.
Negative torque doesn't necessarily mean there was an engine failure. You would get a transient situation for a second or two. That could trigger that light to come on.
We had a flame out.
He misdiagnoses the situation.
Well, surely he checks his engine's RPMs.
What do you want me to do? Are you going to continue?
Okay, yeah. I'm gonna continue. Just back me up.
He's not even checking to see if there's an actual engine failure.
Look at your instruments, determine whether or not the both engines are generating power. It's not that hard. They're trained for that.
If he had, he would have seen the engine power was where he put it. 100% full power.
If you don't know if you have an engine failure, but you're responding to a potential engine failure, that's not very good, and that could very easily cause an accident.
Let's go, Mr. Approach.
So what actions did the pilots take during the missed approach?
Okay, so how did they configure their plane for their missed approach?
They set engine power to max.
Set max power.
As they should have. What else?
There's no mention of reducing the flaps to 10 or retracting landing gear.
A go-around would be done by informing the other pilot, then apply max power, retract the gear, retract the flaps.
But the pilot's failure to raise the gear or retract the flaps doesn't explain the accident.
Hard to believe that configuration caused the plane to veer to the left and crash.
Well, there's only one way to find out.
There was a necessity to conduct some flight tests because we really wanted to figure out what the crew had introduced in the configuration that would make the aircraft deviate from this intended flight path.
Okay, let's go max power.
Investigators turn to test pilots for help. They'll take a Jetstream 3201 to its limits to try to solve the mystery.
Sometimes you have to put yourself in an uncomfortable position, and you know what's going to happen if you go too far.
Max power.
Flaps to 20.
They start by duplicating the configuration the pilots had set for the missed approach.
Flaps 20.
Gear down.
Okay. Gear down.
Okay, it's a bit slower than a regular missed approach, but it's still doable.
So why did Flight 3379 turn to the left and crash?
Let's do the same configuration, but put max power on the right engine, but not the left.
Roger that.
They try a different configuration in the hope of recreating the pilot's actions.
Max power right engine. Yawing to the left. I can't climb like this.
Investigators finally understand how Captain Hillis executed the missed approach.
Set max power.
Believing his left engine has failed, the captain increases power only to the right engine.
Lower the nose. Lower the nose.
The imbalance in engine power robs the plane of the airspeed it needs to climb out with the gear down and the flaps extended.
the flight test told us an airplane with that configuration could not have been flown safely. It had to crash.
He had that plane configured all around.
Investigators conclude that the captain didn't configure his plane correctly for a missed approach.
If the captain thought one of his engines failed, they should have performed a single-engine missed approach. He didn't do that either.
So he set himself up for a nearly unflyable airplane.
You got it? Yeah.
NTSB investigators focus squarely on the captain of Flight 3379, 29-year-old Michael Hillis.
To come across an accident where a response was botched as poorly as this one, it begs the question, well, how did he get there?
It's got 2,294 hours of turboprops. 3,499 total flying hours.
Well, he's young, but he's no rookie.
NTSB investigators scrutinize the personnel records of the pilots of Flight 3379.
We want to find out the background of the pilots. Is there anything in their performance that can reveal something about their performance on the night of the accident?
From American Eagle's files, the team learns that Michael Hillis was licensed to fly multiple turboprop airplanes.
He starts officer training on the Jetstream in March 1991.
We've got single-engine missed approaches today. Are you ready for that?
Yes, sir.
Investigators dig deeper into Captain Hillis's pilot records.
All right, I am cutting your left engine.
We like to see an airman with airmanship, so we had to look back at the training information.
Look at this. Trainer's evaluation.
Okay, you're losing airspeed that you're gonna need. How do you get it back?
Not sure.
Oh, well, this is telling. He's messing up single-engine missed approaches.
It was very obvious that this captain was having serious troubles with his airmanship development.
Single-engine missed approaches, engine failures.
When is this?
April 1992?
That was 2 years before the accident. He had more than enough time to improve.
Well, he must have dug in. He makes captain a few months later.
By the time pilots become airline pilots, they're pretty good. The selection process is so rigorous that you don't get to be an airline pilot unless you had considerable capabilities.
That's all I have here.
Are there any American Eagle pilots that will talk to us about him?
Let's find out.
The NTSB wants to know more about Hillis's career.
Usually in the pilot file, there'll be some little notes about the issues that have been encountered by other persons in flying with a captain.
What can you tell me about Mike Hillis?
Oh, we're pretty broken up about this.
Investigators track down American Eagle's Raleigh-Durham base manager.
Unfortunately, we had a lot of complaints about his flying.
I was really surprised to hear him say that.
Complaints? From whom?
Well, several first officers that flew with him out of Raleigh.
Co-pilots were whispering to their colleagues it was something not normal.
And we had co-pilots that were afraid to fly with him. And they'd keep a close eye on what he was doing.
Really?
If pilots are afraid to fly with this guy, which is essentially what the base manager told us, that's very revealing about the accident.
He's not.
I hate to say it, but this is a really questionable pilot.
We got a picture of a pilot who could fly okay, but when he was faced with something unexpected, his performance would start deteriorating.
How did this guy end up at American Eagle, huh? Where'd they find him?
This application should be on file.
We try to get as much information as we can for a complete pilot's history.
His previous job was with Comair.
Captain Hillis applied to work for American Eagle in October 1990 while he was flying for another airline.
Find out if they did a background check on this guy.
When investigators ask American Eagle about background checks on Mike Hillis, they're shocked by what they learn.
They did not go back and check with previous employers.
The NTSB does what American Eagle never did. They requisition Mike Hillis's file from Comair.
When we compared his records with Comair with his records at American Eagle, they were consistent.
Moody, unpredictable, gets distracted. Concerns about tunnel vision in an emergency situation.
And he was potentially a dangerous pilot.
Tunnel vision in an emergency situation. Comair could see it.
This guy wanted him fired. This just keeps getting worse.
I've never encountered before or since a pilot who was recommended to be terminated because he was potentially unsafe.
Comair recommended for dismissal. When did they fire him?
He resigns from Comair before they can fire him.
That captain should not have been flying passengers under any circumstances.
Did American Eagle know about this guy's performance history?
It doesn't look like they asked.
There's no record of Comair providing it to American Eagle.
But the picture is crystal clear. Michael Hillis's flying career was blemished by failed certification tests, bad evaluations from trainers, and complaints from colleagues that were never passed on to American Eagle.
One would have to ask themselves, if you really knew the background of this pilot, would you put your wife or your child in that aircraft? And the answer would be no.
But there were two pilots in the cockpit of Flight 3379.
Lower the nose. Lower the nose!
In this case, the ability of the first officer to recognize that the captain's skills were deficient, it took a long time.
Did the first officer know who he was flying with?
Here.
Investigators wonder if First Officer Saylor knew he was teamed with an unreliable pilot.
First Officer Matthew Ian Saylor, 25 years old. Worked for American Eagle for a year before the crash.
The NTSB looks into the work schedules of First Officer Saylor and Captain Hillis.
Have you flown with Hillis before?
No, not once.
They discover the first officer was new to this particular route.
So was he based out of Raleigh?
No. He worked out of Miami.
I think it was critical to this accident that the first officer was from a different base than the captain.
First officers in Raleigh-Durham need to keep a close eye on him, but he's out of Miami.
This guy had no idea who he was flying with.
Let's go ahead and go speeds high.
When First Officer Saylor joins Captain Hillis in the cockpit on December the 13th, 1994, he has no idea what type of pilot he's teamed with.
This pilot should never have been a pilot in command of that aircraft.
As Flight 3379 is on final approach for Raleigh-Durham, Captain Hillis is caught by surprise. He misinterprets the illumination of an ignition light.
Why is that ignition light on? Did we just have a flame out?
I'm not sure what's going on with it.
We had a flame out.
Captain Hillis doesn't realize that by increasing the propeller speed too quickly, he has created a momentary negative torque condition.
He misdiagnosed it as an engine failure and responded improperly.
I'm going to continue.
Instead of landing, Hillis decides to do a go-around.
Let's go, Mr. Proch.
Starting with the captain's misdiagnosis of an engine failure and his decision to go around, it pretty much was self-induced engine failure.
The pilots now face a severe emergency.
The gear was down. He was trying to climb.
Set max power.
It was impossible in that configuration. They're basically about to go off the edge of the cliff.
Lower the nose.
It falls to the first officer to rectify the captain's mistakes.
Here!
I think he could have saved the airplane, but by the time he recognized that, it was too late.
"15 people are killed because of Hillis's errors."
Made every mistake in the book in the last 2 minutes of the flight.
I had anger, sure, at that time for the pilot and the co-pilot for the errors that they made. Ultimately, there was more pointing fingers to the airline.
At American Eagle, access documents about Hillis's past before they hired him. He might not have been in that cockpit on December 13th, 1994.
The final takeaway from 3379 is that we've got to identify those airmen that don't display airmanship qualities.
The crash of Flight 3379 reveals deep flaws in the standard hiring practices of U.S. airlines. Background information on pilots is almost never shared amongst airlines.
If I was to apply for a job somewhere, they would check my references. This is a pilot. Isn't it important that we find out if this person is competent enough?
We asked for it in 88, 90.
Tragically, the case of Flight 3379 is not unprecedented.
And again in 93.
In 3 previous accidents, the NTSB recommended that records from previous employers be made available to a pilot's current employer.
4 times the charm.
Now, for the 4th time, the NTSB recommends that U.S. airlines conduct better background checks on prospective pilots. But still, no changes are made to federal regulations.
I felt like I had to do something. I had to speak for these 15 people that couldn't speak. And I went and spoke in front of Congress.
In 1996, 2 years after the crash, U.S. Congress passes the Pilots Record Information Act to ensure airlines have access to previous companies' pilot records.
The chances of a pilot falling through the cracks, as this captain did, have been reduced because of that legislation. It's unfortunate for that to happen, but that's what it took.